Hey everybody, welcome to another CS0 Intro to Java Programming video. In this video we're going to get started on the Unit 5 content, Intro to Objects. In this video I just wanted to show you what writing a class looks like and instantiating an object from it looks like. We've been working with objects all along and we've kind of talked about them a little bit, but we're going to go into more detail on it. So I'm going to make a very basic class and then I'm going to instantiate an object from it. So I'll go new, class, I'm going to call it circle, and a circle is going to be defined as having an int for a radius, a double for area. Okay, these are the two things that will define the circle. Oh, I suppose we could also have a circumference as well. I'll call it circ. There we go. Usually, classes are going to be comprised of variables or a data set and methods, which are the things that that class can do. So I'm going to give it a set of methods that will be our interface with that class. So I'll go code, generate, because I'm lazy, getter and setter, and do it for all of them. If you are just sort of following along with this, it's okay. You don't need to write this code with me. I'm just going to use it as kind of a test. So I've got a bunch of methods that are getters and setters. What they're going to be used for is accessing and modifying all of these variables. Classes also usually have something called a constructor. Constructor always, well, it kind of looks like a method, but the method identifier is always the same name as the class. So see circle, circle, they're exactly the same. It's not a method exactly because it does not have a return specified. There's no void, there's no return type, nothing. I'm going to take in R for the circle because it's going to define the radius. Radius gets R. All right, this is just the definition of a class. Once again, you don't need to write this code along with me. Just kind of watch how I use this class and see what I do with it. So the purpose of this circle is going to represent all of the data that a circle would have. It would have a radius, it would have an area, and it would have a circumference. I probably would also want to have methods that will calculate the area and circumference. Public double calc area, and it's going to return 2 pi r. So, I mean, pardon me, pi r squared. 2 pi r is circumference. So we need math.pi times math.pow radius squared. We've seen math.pi and math.pow in a previous unit. So here I'm just making a method that's going to return the area. I'll also make a method that'll return the circumference. Public double calc circ, and this one is 2 pi r. So return 2 times math.pi times radius, and I'm going to actually use these here in the constructor. So what the constructor is going to do is that when I create an object of type circle, it's going to give us a radius, then it'll calculate the area, and then it'll calculate the circumference. So calc area, and that is going to be stored in, because it's got a return, I'm going to store that value in area. So area will get calc area. Circ is going to get calc circ. All right, so now I have a class. This class represents information about a circle. It's going to represent the radius, the area and the circumference. It has the ability to calculate the area and circumference. It also has the ability to modify things like radius and retrieve the radius, modify the area and retrieve the area, so on and so forth. Okay, that's my circle class. Now, how do we use this circle class? I'm going to make another class here where we're going to instantiate a circle. I'll go new, and I have a handy dandy template for drawing here, my basic drawing template. I'm going to call it draw circles, not cross circles. Click OK, and I've got it's starting off with all of my instance variables for my J panel and my button. I've got an action listener. I've got my main method. I've got all that stuff to create my GUI, all that kind of stuff. And I've got my action performed. Now what I want to do is I want to create a circle. Okay, and it's from my default package here, not from JavaFX. I'm just going to call it C1. All right, when you make a class, automatically that class becomes a new type. We've talked about types in Java before. Examples of types are going to be our primitive types like int, double, short, long, char, byte. Then we also have our reference types, things like JTextField, JLabel, string, JPanel, JFrame. These are all reference types. So anytime you want to create a variable of one of those reference types, you define a variable name to that type. So there is a class that somebody wrote called JPanel. It's going to look a lot like this. It's going to have its own instance variables. It's going to have its own set of constructors, probably a bunch of constructors, a whole bunch of methods, and but it's not any different than this circle that I just created. So anytime you use one of these reference types like JButton, JPanel, JFrame, somebody else wrote a class for that. Now we have in the past, all along in fact, have been instantiating objects. For example, draw circles frame gets new draw circles. This is the process of instantiation. In other words, I have a class called draw circles right here, right? And what I'm doing is I'm creating a new draw circles object in this main method. What that means is that Java is going to set aside memory locations for all the stuff that describes draw circles. In other words, it's going to set aside memory locations for all of these instance variables. It's also going to set aside memory locations where all the variable or the method states will be stored. So when I instantiate something, it's bringing all this data here and all these methods possibility into being. I'm creating a thing from this concept. Okay, let's actually create one of those circles. I'm going to do it in, I'm just going to do it in Create GUI here. So down below the Draw button, it's called C1, gets new circle. And if we look back at the circle's constructor definition, the parameter requires that we take in an R. We take in an int called R. That's our radius. Now, if you think back to the last unit when we talked about methods and parameters, this thing being the formal parameter, and then when we make the call, we pass an actual parameter into it, like 15. This is the actual parameter 15. Well, that 15 is going to get stored in a memory location associated with that instance of a circle. So 15 comes into R, it gets stored in radius. Now when I do this step, whoops, where am I here? I'm in the wrong place. There we go. When I do this step right here, the instantiation, we have something called the new operator. The new operator is the part of this statement that's going to allocate space in the computer's memory to store all the information for that instance of that object. Now I can create as many circles objects as I want. I can create 15, I can create 1,000,000. And each one of them is going to have their own separate memory locations allocated for its own personal data. So I could have one circle that's 15, one circle that's 27, one circle that's 32, one circle that's 999, and each one of those is still a circle, but it is, each of them are their own instance of circle that will behave independently. They'll have their own area, they'll have their own circumference, they'll have all of their own data. That's the relationship between a class and an object. Okay? I'm going to just use this object somewhere. I'm going to actually use it in action performed. I'm going to draw a circle. Draw oval, and I'm just going to set it at 10 and 10. And now I need a height and a width for the oval, and it's going to be C1 dot get radius times 2 C1 dot get radius times 2. Okay, so why am I doing this? C1 dot get radius. Get radius is a method in the circle class that is going to return the radius value of this object C1. Okay, I'm going to run this and see how it looks. There, I've got my circle right there at 10 and 10. My radius was, I don't recall, what did I set it to, 15 or something? My radius was set to 15. Okay, so I've got a 15 pixel radius here, circle that's drawn at 10 and 10. All right? Now, let's make another circle. I'm going to make one called C2, just so you can see that you can have many different objects of that same type. So I'll make another variable called C2 of type circle. I'll come down here and I'll make another circle. And I'm going to make this one 100 radius. And I'll draw another, except this time instead of C1, I'll get my radius from C2. So I'm going to retrieve the radius from the C2 object, multiply it by 2 because that's going to give us the height or the width, and then get the radius again, multiply it by 2, and that's going to give us the height. So I'll run it, and when I draw this, you should see a second circle appear as well as the first. Whoops, I've got an error. Let's see what my error says. I've got something called a Nullpointerexception, and let's see where that's coming up. It's coming up right here. This is actually just a mistake, because this is a mistake I make frequently, and the great thing is I know exactly how to fix it. And this is a mistake that you'll probably make frequently as well. Now here's what a Nullpointerexception is. It means that you've created a variable of a reference type. So I created a circle called C2. And then I go down and I try and use that circle, C2. Okay? Now let's see. Did I ever instantiate that circle? I'm going to look for it. I'm going to look where I instantiated C1. I instantiated C1 there, and oh, remember when I copy and pasted? I instantiated C1 again. I actually have to instantiate C2. There we go. Now what the Nullpointerexception says is trying to call a method on a reference variable that has no object in it. So when I just had C1, I made a new object into C1 that second time around, and it was 100. C2 was never instantiated. You can actually see there's a hint up here. Notice how C1 is purple but C2 is gray. A grayed out variable means it has never been assigned. You can even see the little tooltip there, private field C2 is never assigned. That means if I try and call a method to it, there's no object in there. In other words, it's just null in that variable. And you've got a method trying to be called to a null reference, and that's when you get that Nullpointerexception. So if you ever get one of these Nullpointerexceptions thrown, luckily I did this time because I made a stupid mistake, you know how to fix it. It means you need to make sure you instantiate that object. So here, the thing is, I copied that statement, but I didn't change one thing because I was moving fast. Now I've got an object in C1 and an object in C2. The object in C1 is 15. The object in C2 is 100. I'll run it and see how it looks. Don't you love it when you get those accidents and they actually help? There we go. Now I've got my circle object that was 15 and it's drawn there, and I've got my circle object that's 100 and it's drawn right there. All right, so as you can see, you make a class, and that class is going to represent all the data that will describe this thing that you want to model. It's also going to have a bunch of methods that will perform functions that you want this thing to do. Then from that one class, you can make as many instances of it as you want, and all of those instances will behave independently. All right, so that's a little bit about the class object relationship. If you did not get any of this code, I don't care. In fact, I just wanted you to kind of listen, and I wanted you to kind of soak in this information, this philosophy behind class object relationship. We're going to write classes and instantiate objects from them in a much later unit when we actually go deeper into object orientation. But for now, this is just your first dipping your toes in the OO waters. Thanks for watching.